Hello everyone, this is Genuine Polish. So, do you have a need for a petroleum boiler, but you're like me and every time you unearth a volcano you completely and utterly destroy your base? Well, stick around because this is 3 petroleum boilers that don't use volcanoes at all. One is a cool, safe early game method that's actually kind of practical, plus a variation on that. The second one is actually a really good alternative to volcano petroleum boilers, period, but it does require late game materials. Finally, the last one is just for fun, but with how ridiculous it is, it's actually pretty practical, so stick around for that one. So, for our first boiler, we're going to be taking advantage of a very unique property of Red Bull generators. See, Red Bull generators don't have an overheat temperature. That means you can run them all the way to their melting point without having to worry about them overheating and breaking and having to repair them. For this first system, I recommend using pit flower pot planting to plant weezeworts so that way you can seal them inside these chambers and you don't have to worry about going back in and potentially breaking the vacuum. So for a quick overview with weezeworts, they emit radiation 6 tiles in every direction from the center of the weezeworts, so keep that in mind as we go through the build. So we're going to build 0 heat transfer vacuum rooms. In order to do this, you're just going to surround the interior of a room with airflow tiles and draw a vacuum. This is going to completely eliminate the heat transfer from the liquids. If you want to, you could build all these systems in space, taking advantage of cosmic radiation, and then just emit the air tiles, because while the temperature is pretty hot, it's not hot enough to run the risk of melting the tiles. So you're good just getting rid of the airflow tiles if you build this in space. I can't stress this enough. Make sure you use dryball or temp ship plates for the background. As someone who's personally dumped like 1,000,000 kilograms of ethanol into space, it's really easy to overlook a single tile of space exposure, and it takes no time at all for that single tile to drain an entire giant basins. So use a 1-tile path for the petroleum to travel through the contactless pump. I'll link a video that goes a little bit more in depth on the contactless pump in the description below. I recommend using 4 tiles or more distance. You don't want to do a ridiculous length like 10 tiles or something, because then you're going to minimize the amount of liquid that you can actually pull out of the main chamber, and if you go any shorter than 4 tiles, you run the risk of overpressurizing the petroleum and having that flood into the contactless pump room, and it'll overheat the contactless pump and completely break your vacuum. So make sure you do 4 tiles or more. Make sure you add some way to control your pump so that way it's not just running constantly. Finally, connect a thermal sensor to the Red Bull generators so they don't boil the petroleum into sour gas. I recommend going a couple degrees below the boiling point of petroleum, but enough over the temperature where crude oil transfers to petroleum, so that way the bulk of your liquid has a lot of excess heat to give off, and every time new crude oil comes through, it's not going to cool all your petroleum and you'll have to wait for it to heat up. I'm using 425 degrees Celsius here. You could actually bump that up pretty significantly. Just make sure to pay attention to the thermal properties of your specific room depending on how you build it. And then finally, you'll want to control the flow of crude oil into the room so that way you have a slow, steady production of petroleum versus creating a huge batch of petroleum all at once from a whole bunch of crude oil. Either way works, but it's been my experience that it's better just to have the slow production of petroleum versus huge batches. For all of these designs, you're going to benefit from having the outgoing petroleum transfer heat into the crude oil reservoir. So you'll want to build a radiator inside the crude oil reservoir, and this is going to help bring the petroleum down to a more manageable temperature and preheat the crude oil that's coming in. Now, if you have access to neobium or thermium, you can make a pump out of either one of those and completely submerge it. This makes the room a little bit more compact, and you don't have to worry about potentially overpressurizing your petroleum and flooding your contactless pump. Here's an example of a more optimized placement of the weezeworts. You can see that you can power a pretty significant amount of generators from just a single weezewort. Now, the placement of this pump should eliminate the chance for crude oil to make its way into the pump, but if you overfeed your room and you have crude oil that's completely flooded the pump, you may want to incorporate a filter and just have a simple feedback loop so that way any crude oil that accidentally goes out the petroleum output gets sent back into the reservoir so that way it can be heated. As long as you control your crude oil input, it shouldn't be necessary, but you don't want to have crude oil heading down the pipe where your petroleum is headed. So as a precaution, I'd recommend just throwing in a filter there. So that's system 1 and its variant. Now for system 2, if you already have neobium and thermium, there's a much simpler solution to quickly boil crude oil, and this is by far the best alternative to volcano petroleum boilers. So for the veteran players out there, you probably already know what I'm getting at here, an aqua tuner. So aqua tuners produce a ridiculous amount of heat. The issue is that they have an overheat temperature. But when you're working with neobium and thermium, you can easily boil petroleum using either one of these metals. The amount of heat that one aqua tuner produces is equivalent to over 100 Red Bull generators, while costing significantly less power. Make sure to build a basic bypass loop and a liquid pipe thermal sensor so that way you don't run the risk of either freezing the coolant that you're putting through the system or boiling it in case you have long periods of inactivity. In this setup, I have the thermal sensor for the liquid and the thermal sensor for the pipe connected to one AND gate so that way they control the operation of the aqua tuner, and that way we're going to make sure that we're not going to boil the liquid or freeze it and break the pipes. Now finally, I have a treat for you. This is mostly a fun build, but as ridiculous as it is, it's actually feasible. So, a really cool interaction for metal refineries is that they can be used to basically heat liquid indefinitely. So we're going to build a really big zero heat transfer vacuum room. And again, you can build this in space if you'd like. The temperature is going to be well below the melting point of the tiles, so you don't have to worry about heat transfer. It's just that you don't want those tiles emanating heat into the rest of your base. So as a precaution, we'll seal it with 2 mechanical airlocks and 1 liquid airlock. Now, assuming you don't have neobium or thermium, you have to build another contactless pump. Make sure that the area under the refinery is sufficient enough so that you're not going to flood the mesh tiles. This is kind of a ridiculous build, but it does produce a lot of petroleum pretty quickly. So you're going to want to build a liquid meter and set it to 400 kilograms, and this is going to control the inflow of your crude oil. I have this meter connected to an alarm so that way I know when the refinery is full. So depending on the input temperature of the crude oil, you're probably going to have to send this through a couple of times. So you'll want to build a simple feedback loop from the output of the metal refinery back to the input of the metal refinery. So when the crude oil has reached an adequate temperature, it'll transfer to petroleum and just break the output pipe as it leaves the metal refinery. And then this is going to cause 100 kilograms of petroleum just to dump straight down under the ground. Don't bother repairing the pipe, just go ahead and delete it and rebuild it so that way you're not going to be using resources. And pretty much as soon as you rebuild it, it's just going to empty another 100 kilograms of petroleum onto the ground. So this system does require a lot of micromanaging, but you can actually produce a lot of petroleum this way. Alright everyone, that's going to be it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I actually think the second system is a really good alternative to volcano petroleum boilers, and I think I'm going to incorporate that into my Let's Play. If you like my videos, please like, comment, and subscribe. Everything helps. I'm trying to give you regular auction not included content, but look forward to Let's Plays for different game series, and of course tutorials and tricks for those ones as well.